Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Leader of the Opposition, over to you.
Thank you. I just want to make sure my audio is coming through.
It's coming through loud and clear.
Great. Thank you very much. Again, let me recognize all those who are in the office today at the press conference. Specifically, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairperson, for your introductory remarks, and also to thank Farah for her very passionate intervention this morning, which is very, very important. And so we also want to wish many solutions a fruitful Jeune Creole. Sadly, it will be disrupted as it was in the last couple of years because of COVID. And I know that we are all suffering from COVID fatigue at this point, and all of us are looking forward to putting this behind us and getting back to some level of normalcy. It's a very bitter pill, I know, for many to swallow what is transpiring. Mr. Chairperson, with your permission, what I would like to do is to maybe break down this discussion in really important parts. First part to deal with the curfew itself.
Our first March of 2020. And we have gone through several different tiers of approaches towards COVID. Obviously, with the initial introduction of the state of the emergency and a countrywide curfew for a period of weeks, and then the partial
So you
Hello?
can have a lot of questions. Okay? So
can I continue?
Yeah.
Yes. Please continue.
Okay, so with 18 months that we've had to go through different levels of managing this COVID crisis. And certainly once we understood that this COVID crisis was going to be lasting much longer than we had all anticipated, that the decision was to actually create the COVID Act. And the COVID Act is an amalgamation of the Health Act and the Quarantine Act in order to make it easier for us to proceed legislatively. So the first thing I want to really discuss is the curfew. The curfew has been a long debated issue, and for some people it was egregious that a government would be restricting people's movements from their home for a period of time, or as we had it from as early as 4 o'clock in the afternoon, sometimes 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but more commonly by about 7 o'clock in the evening until 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. The curfew is a tool that is used globally to combat the pandemic. Every country in the world during this period of COVID has implemented periods of a curfew all around the world. European countries, African countries, small island developing states, Latin America, the more developed countries of the world, all of them have used curfews at one point in time. So the curfew really comes out of the science as a tool to be used to combat COVID. As I've explained, the COVID Act is an amalgamation of several different pieces of legislation that existed in order to better facilitate and modernize what we were doing. So you had the Health Act and you had the Quarantine Act. Some of them, the Quarantine Act, is over 50 years since it was amended. And so there would have been many changes, i.e. electronic bracelets, the level of traveling that was taking place that it would not have made reference to. And so those acts were brought into, and the COVID Act amended them and modernized many of them. So the United Workers' Party, when we were in government, once we understood that there was a need to implement a curfew, and due to the lack of, I think, specifically of the Constitution. So the Constitution makes references to your freedom of association, liberties. And therefore, we wanted to make sure that the COVID Act was not in contravention of that Constitution. And it was our opinion that the imposition of a curfew is a restriction of your civil liberty, and as such had to be treated very differently. So while the COVID Act contemplates social distancing as well as assembly, we made it very clear from the onset that it could not be used to infringe or restrict your civil liberties, i.e., the implementation of a curfew. So the CMO, to be exact, can confine you to quarantine, which the Act speaks specifically of, or isolation. It can confine certain areas. So, for instance, if there was an outbreak in a community, we could impose restrictions of movement in that specific area. But in each instance, it had to be accompanied with the proof that the persons were either tested positive or through contact tracing were deemed to be of high risk. The same thing applied for persons who were traveling to St. Lucia, both tourists who remained in a bubble or St. Lucia nationals who had to be quarantined or isolated, depending on the results of their test. But we made it clear and we repeated that this did not, in our opinion, apply to the implementation of a curfew. So the Constitution makes several provisions for the freedom of movement of people, the assembly of people, and as indicated, your civil liberties. Section 14(3) of the Constitution, which deals with emergency powers. Section 3 specifically deals that if you are going to implement a law that needs to restrict your civil liberties, that it must be done in the form of a state of emergency. And let's ask ourselves why. So it's all good and well for politicians to talk about transparency and accountability, but it's not the words that matter, it's actually what actually follows that matters. So United Workers' Party is very proud of the fact that once the decision had been made to have a curfew, and as I indicated, the curfew comes out of science, comes out of past experiences and examples globally in terms of how countries were dealing with the COVID outbreak and understanding what COVID is in terms of that it is a virus that spreads through the contact of different people. So if you do have a situation in which you have a high rate of community spread, a curfew is the mechanism to be used. Now, the Labour Party clearly believes that the science is still supporting the need for a curfew. And certainly when one looks at the numbers that we've had and the number of deaths that we've had in the last 2 months, they're right, that we do need to have a curfew. So the argument is not about whether we need or should have a curfew. Although when we were in government, the Labour Party questioned and advocated against the need for a curfew. So if now you're going to implement the curfew, why would the United Workers' Party choose the state of emergency? We chose a state of the emergency simply because there are many more people involved and there is a legal requirement for transparency and accountability. One, the government must make the request to the Governor General to impose a state of emergency. So it means a third-party person is involved. The Governor General makes reference to the Constitution, and even globally, a pandemic qualifies as a very good reason to have a state of emergency. War is another very good example of need for a state of emergency. And there are other examples that are offered to the Governor General. So on being satisfied that there is a rationale for having a state of emergency, he proceeds to make that declaration. And that declaration will only last for 1 week. At that time, the government is required to come into Parliament and debate the need for a state of emergency and to indicate for how long the state of emergency is going to be imposed for. Section 14.3 says that if you want to restrict or take away civil liberties, it must be done in the confines of the state of the emergency. So it means you must create a law that's passed once the state of emergency has been declared, and that law only stays in effect for the period of time of the state of emergency. Another admirable quality of the state of the emergency is that on the end of a state of emergency, the government must provide a report to Parliament, which will be made public, to account for its actions during the period of the state of emergency. So anything that you did during the state of emergency, using and referring to the state of emergency, you must be accountable for them. So I think that as a young country, 44 years of age, and as we create our own precedents, meaning sometimes we have to interpret the Constitution, unless we have the opportunity of challenging a constitution in the courts. And challenging a constitution is a good thing because it helps now for all of us to understand what the interpretation is. But in the absence of taking it to the court, and given the choice of using a state of emergency and going through the procedures prescribed in the state of the emergency in order to take away or to restrict people's civil liberties, in comparison to what the Labour Party is attempting to do today. So one, the Labour Party is trying to use the COVID Act as a legal authority to impose a curfew. They don't even have the courage to call it a curfew. In their attempts to justify their actions, they've chosen to use the word confinement, which is the first telltale or the first sign to show the lack of any genuineness to their actions. The COVID Act only makes reference to confinement when it comes to social distancing and makes it very clear that people cannot be confined, can only be confined through isolation or through quarantine. Means that people have to have been tested positive or the CMO must have deemed that they are high risk. The United Workers' Party repeatedly said that the COVID Act does not contemplate a curfew. So those are the two choices. The Labour Party can decide a significant right given to St. Lucians is going to be taken away from them on an act that was never designed to do so, and only to do what? To protect them because of the embarrassment that they now have to suffer of one, recognizing that a curfew is necessary to fight COVID. And yes, it does challenge and infringe on people's civil liberties. But the Constitution contemplates that there would be a need or a reason at some point to restrict people's civil liberties. And it gives you a context in which to do so. Or you can choose to do what the Labour Party has done, to confine people to their homes, which is a curfew, and to do it in a manner which is unconstitutional, not transparent, and there is no accountability. There's no special law that has to be debated in Parliament. There's no report that has to be provided. And what they're doing is now challenging a precedence that we're establishing. And I would say the United Workers' Party stands firm in its decision that when we had to impose a curfew, that we did it the more difficult way. We did it the way in which the people of this country's rights were held in the highest esteem. And our actions reflected the severity of the need to curtail people's civil liberty. What is worrying to me and what is worrying to many people of United Workers' Party supporters is the hypocrisy that is taking place. That the same persons who wanted to say that the COVID Act was an infringement on people's rights, even though we said it did not apply to a curfew, will now either stand in public and support the COVID Act's ability to do that, or worse yet, say nothing. To say nothing. And this is the greatest risk that we run as a young country, is when we're not scared, we're not brave enough to challenge the status quo. When we ourselves only want to defend our rights when it's politically expedient to do so. That is the problem. So I want to say, and I want to end at this point, that we will continue to advocate and do everything we possibly can to defend the civil rights of the people of St. Lucia, to defend the right processes when it comes to the implementation of our Constitution and when it comes to governing in our country. I thank you.
It protects your period.
Thank you, Dolly.
Thank you, Mr. Political Leader, for that comprehensive presentation. We now ask members of the press if you have any questions. This is where we take them. Any questions?
My questions are not pertaining to the statement on the review. We just saw the media visit Jude Hospital, and as we can see, it's still mild low-income population. I was wondering the political leaders' thoughts on the recent
Political leader, the question here on the floor is for you. It has to do with the St. Jude's Hospital. The media had a tour recently, and I think they would like to know your thoughts on the position of the hospital, as well as the tour which they undertaken. In fact, the senators before that and parliamentarians and cabinet of ministers visited the hospital. I was privileged to have been on one of those tours, and what I saw before the political leader comes on is night and day. The people who are doing the design were absolutely clear about the old section. I saw some of the low ceilings myself. The designs were completely flawed, in line with the report that came out from FDL. And I'm not sure if the media saw it, but what we're dealing with is a hospital that was designed back in the dark ages. This was not designed originally as a hospital. It was a military barracks, and really and truly, we are now in the 21st century, where a hospital must meet certain standards and guidelines internationally if we are going to be able to dispense health care. The new building, which we started and which is almost completed, it's our position that the St. Lucia Labour Party administration should continue that in the interest of the people of the South. Mr. Political Leader.
Thank you very much, Dominic. My sentiments exactly. The fact is, when we came into government, we didn't make any promise that we would stop or make any statements that we would stop the St. Jude's Hospital. Our intention was to complete St. Jude's Hospital. And it was when the ministers, followed up by the technocrats, gave us a report as to what it would have taken to have completed the project. And that letter and that report was very much in line with the letter that was written to the then Prime Minister back in 2011, in which he was told in March or April of 16, that they would take another $80 million and in excess of almost 8 or 9 months to complete the project. And the question became, to complete the project for that amount of money and what you were going to get at the end of the day had to be taken into consideration. And so once we knew that we were going to be doing the new airport, which is a tripling of the expansion, once you understood our plan for the development of the South, so it means that the South, this wasn't just about a community hospital anymore, this was about creating an institution that could become international, because remember we had talked about building the fifth finger at the OKEU to have an international facility there. The decision was, and after the deliberations with all the different partners involved, that building that international facility in Vieux Fort was more appropriate. Hopefully when the media went to visit it, they would understand that there was a proper design. So unlike the first project at St. Jude's, there was no design. It was build as you go. This project has a design. I've seen all of the detailed drawings to be able to move the operation from the stadium to the ground floor of the existing building. And that you would then expand as you go to the upstairs. And we were in discussions with the Cayman Health City group with an idea of them operating an international hospital similar to Cayman Health City, in Vieux Fort. The goal was also to attract investors to build a medical university at the old St. Jude's facility. And I think if you go there and you look at the building and you see the structures, it's actually extremely suitable to be a very good university. And there are not many hospitals, international universities in the Caribbean which have an adjoining hospital. So that would make St. Jude's a unique position in which it could provide the healthcare needs of the growing community in the South, meet the expansion needs, and also with the DSH project, with some of the other hotel projects that were coming into the area, the growth of the secondary home market, having an international hospital is really one of the critical things to be able to move forward. So in that context, I want to say that I'm very proud of what we were able to achieve. I also know that the financing was finally in place to complete the project, and completing the project meant moving the facility from the stadium to the ground floor of the new building.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to ask Honorable Guy Joseph, the former Minister of Economic Development, who was the lead minister on that project. He's going to complement some of the comments made here this morning on that specific project because he knows it intimately, being the former lead minister on the project.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fede. Good morning to the press. On the issue of the St. Jude Hospital, a press conference would be very limited in being able to articulate all of the issues, but I will hasten to say that I did see some of the reports that came out yesterday out of the site visit by the media and some of the questions. And I can draw straight on the point of one of the comments by the engineer that it would take between 18 months and 2 years for completion. And I did see the media reports highlighting what the present Prime Minister said. Now, work is divided into the number of man-hours that are required to complete a project. So if you work 8 hours a day, regular work days, what does it take? It takes 18 months. If you do 3 shifts a day of 8 hours, what does it reduce to? It reduces to 6 months. So if the work had continued from the time that the election was called to now, we would be on the verge of completion, coming towards the end of the year. So, you know, people play around with information to use it in a convenient manner. Engineers have what they learn at school, and I don't criticize professions of that nature, but the man who actually implements the work has a different agenda, because it's how much resources you are willing to put into a project that will determine how quickly you can implement a project. So I know, as the minister who had responsibility for the project, we met with the team of engineers. We met with everybody who was involved, and we asked them for time frames for implementation. And we said, if you work 24 hours, 3 shifts, what would be the outcome? And let me just give you one example to highlight what I'm saying, because I've been there before. After Hurricane Thomas and the Shock Bridge collapsed and the Bois d'Orange Bridge, and there was no access to the north, when we got there the night, you know what the engineers told me? You cannot touch this bridge unless we go in and do all of the assessments. So the chief engineer at the ministry and the permanent secretary at the time said, no work can be done. But the country is shut down because of Hurricane Thomas. I said, okay, no work can be done, everybody go home. I called back 5 contractors and I said, stay back with me. I called the then Prime Minister, Stephenson King, and I said to him, I can open this bridge by tomorrow morning. He said, you sure you can do that? I said, yes, I can do it. Said, okay. At 10 o'clock, we had no fuel. All gas stations closed. We got fuel at the marina. We had to roll the drums. And we started work at 1 o'clock in the morning. And by 5 a.m., the Shock Bridge was open for traffic. And the same Shock Bridge is there today, with minor repairs. So I've been there before. I'm not the persons who come and criticize people. The professionals have their view, and I know that you will hear all of them. Those who said that it would take a few coats of paint, some chemical, some engineers said it would take $5 million to finish the old St. Jude. Now I challenge them. They can quadruple it, take 20 million, and try and finish the old St. Jude and see what would happen. You see, the reality of where we are in St. Lucia is staring us in the face today. And I have no doubt that based on the information that was available, you see what is happening there today? I'm not surprised. Go and look at the record. In 2011, in December of 2011, they had written to fast track the equipment getting here for the opening of the old St. Jude Hospital. And the Labour Party came into office in 2011. And when we came back into office in 2016, the project was 50% complete. And I said they put construction in reverse. I never knew how they were able to do that. So I'm not surprised when the present Prime Minister comes and says, St. Jude would not be finished in how many years? It is obvious. So whichever part of the project that they tackle, whether it be the old one or they continue with the new one, it is resources, it is manpower. Labor is how many hours you're willing to put into it. And anybody who has done construction management or project management would know the flow of work, that there are things that can be done at the same time. Sometimes you can implement 4 aspects of the project within the same time frame with different crews of workers. So we had a time frame, as the former Prime Minister and member for Mikud South highlighted. We sat in the cabinet room with the team of engineers, electrical persons, the air conditioning persons, and we said, if we have all the supplies available on island, what is the time frame that is required for implementation? And these were given. And that is the basis on which we gave the timelines for the completion of St. Jude. Under a UWP government, St. Jude would have been opened this year. Not to full capacity, because I'm not among those who give not the whole 100+ beds. We met with the management of St. Jude and we asked them, what is the minimum number of beds that you can work with to move from the George Odlum Stadium to the St. Jude Hospital? And we were looking at in the region of 50 to 65 beds. We felt that we could have taken it to about 80 beds. And they would be able to operate, so you would operate half the top floor and on the ground floor. And I knew where we left the project. All the plumbing pipes are in the ground. What you have to do, connect your toilets, your face basins, and I can tell you there are 100 and something toilets down in storage. They are the face basins. So that was in place. The electrical items, a number of them was in place. So, because we did not design the hospital the old way where you have to go and break wall to run pipe. So you create a mezzanine wall, which is the modern way of construction. And just like you have the box behind me and all the things are running through there, it's a lot easier to do so. So we have a very modern design for St. Jude that is going to meet the requirements of an accredited hospital facility. Let me just hasten to say to the media, I heard the member for Central Castries call it a glorified car park. I mean, that is the level at which these people insult the intelligence of people in this country. I was in the US. I went to UMass Hospital in Boston. I took photos that I have on my phone. And you can see, I took the pictures about 4 different hospitals in the US. And you know what it is? Same thing that we have. A frame, concrete columns, whatever it is, glass windows and panels. That is the modern way of construction. And we didn't just put glass windows, we put tapered glass that can withstand a certain strength of wind up to a category 5 hurricane. The buildings, while they are looking as if it is one single building, there are soft joints in between that permits for a certain magnitude earthquake, so that if the building moves, one does not hit against the other, because most buildings that are built in one complete structure is more likely to crumble after an earthquake. I didn't do the design. We got international people, and the people they have reviewing St. Jude Hospital, I want to know whether they've ever built a health center in their life. Because hospitals are specialized. The hospitals are not ordinary houses or warehouses or buildings to house offices. That is what this is about. So we had a crew from Italy. Why, when we had to build the OKEU, we could not get no locals to be able to build the hospital or to do the design? Because it was the EU money being spent, and they have their standards. And we can go right there to Trinidad. They've built 5 hospitals maybe in the last 10 years, 10 to 15 years in Trinidad. Go and check, and you would see our hospital is priced at a fraction of what any other hospital in the Caribbean region has cost. And the time frames in which we are implementing. So the same engineers who spoke to the media, ask them the time frames they gave us for where we are in the building. Remember, we started in October with almost a year of impact of COVID. And look at October of 2019, and look at how far we are with the, you know how many years they gave us to complete the hospital? And we have reached that far with it. So the work that has been done is done in less than half the time they gave us. So why wouldn't I believe the second phase of the work to be completed cannot be completed within half the time or 1/3 of the time? Resources and manpower. That is what makes work happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, former Minister of Economic Development, Mr. Guy Joseph. Do we have any more questions from the press?
Just one question. As to why he didn't resign following the general elections, and what is crucial like considering politics?
Are you referring to Mr. Guy Joseph or the political leader?
Political leader.
Okay. Mr. Political Leader, there's another question here for you from HTS. The question is, why didn't you resign following the general elections results?
Mistaken that I actually offered my letter of resignation to my party, and my party turned it down. But I think that you're probably in a better position to respond to that because you were in the room. So I continue to perform because I believe I have the passion to do so, and also that I continue to have the confidence of the people in my party.
Well, the question, in case you didn't hear, the response to the question really, and I can attest to it, we had a meeting about 3 or 4 days following the general elections, and the political leader did offer his resignation, but the party overwhelmingly rejected his resignation and asked him to stay on as politically. So this was a unanimous decision taken by the national executive that had a meeting immediately in the aftermath of the general elections. Any more questions?
Your views on the ancillary protests?
My views on the ancillary protests, which took place sometime yesterday, I must say that I'm very, very proud of the community and the actions that they have taken. It has been a very long-standing concern on behalf of the people of ancillary, and you know, the fact that the trucks that are coming from the quarries, we've had meetings with at least one of those companies trying to see how best we can ameliorate the situation. But I think that the residents would have lost their patience, and it's good to see the community taking that matter into its own hands. I saw UWP supporters, I saw SLP supporters. It was very, very good to see the community coming together and in a sense of common purpose to ensure that something that is important to them got rectified. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Political Leader. Thank you, Senator Ferry-Polius. Thank you very much, former Minister of Economic Development, Mr. Guy Joseph. Thank you to members of the media that are here. We want to thank our listeners. We want to thank the executive of the United Workers' Party for organizing and sponsoring. We want to thank Sky FM for the live stream and GDTV as well for sponsoring the live stream. We want to thank the Flabo Train membership group. We want to thank all the various constituency groups, well-wishers and supporters. We thank you very much for your outstanding support to this press conference. Thank you so very kindly. Thank you.
That there is a need for a curfew. Changing the name of a curfew to confinement is not the legal solution to the problem. And we are in great breach of our own civil liberties. And it's something that needs to be taken much more seriously. The United Workers' Party is not for us to determine whether there should be a state of emergency. The state of emergency is determined whether, in fact, we need a curfew. And clearly, by their own actions, the Labour Party agrees that there ought to be a curfew. And if there's going to be a curfew, just legally do it the right way. But I see they continue to rely on the COVID Act to do so. And we're appealing to all civil society and to the general public to make their voices heard on this issue, because this is a very sad and very dangerous precedence that we're allowing to be established here.
Thank you for those final words, Mr. Political Leader, and thank you again, all of our listeners and our viewers. That will do it for today. We will inform you when is our next press conference. Thank you so very much.